Today we're going to talk about a case eerily similar to Silence of the Lambs. But before we get started, welcome to True Crime with Maneater. If you love all things true crime, including missing person cases, cold cases, and just the strange happenings of the world, you've come to the right place. Be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. Let's get started. Before we dive into the details of this case, I do want to warn everyone that today's case might be disturbing and triggering to some viewers. So please proceed with caution as you move forward. In 1998, Katarzyna Zawato was a 23-year-old college student at a local university in Krakow, Poland. She had changed her field of study from psychology to religious studies. Krakow, Poland is one of the largest cities in Poland, and it's known primarily for its historical architect, and the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization designated its marketplace, which is the main square, as a World Heritage Site in 1978. And that marketplace, the main square, has actually been around since the 13th century. In 1996, 2 years before Katarzyna went to college, she had actually lost her father, and this greatly impacted her life. The few friends that she did have recalled that she was really nice, but she was actually quite reserved and quiet. But when her father passed away, she actually became very withdrawn and depressed. She was an only child, and she was very close to her father. Her and her father had gone hiking one day, and that's something that the two loved to do together, and they did it often. And he had actually fallen and would suffer from a spinal cord injury, which would lead to an illness that eventually took his life. And unfortunately, Katarzyna would often blame herself for her father's death, and this only worsened her mental health. She went into a serious depression and was really struggling to deal with the death of her father. I want to know as we move forward that most of the news coverage for this case is in Polish. Obviously, it happened in Poland. There's very few news articles in English. So it's really hard to kind of pull information and also to try to translate articles from Poland. Katarzyna really enjoyed sci-fi movies and novels. They were her favorite. Obviously, she loved to hike with her father, but the hobby she found most enjoyable was actually listening to music. And she spent a lot of time browsing through record stores looking for new music to listen to. On November 12th, 1998, Katarzyna was actually meeting her mother, Marta, at the doctor's. She was going to her appointment to obviously talk about her mental health and her depression and things like that. And Marta actually oftentimes went with her daughter. Marta felt that it was important for her to attend those appointments with her daughter to make sure that she was, first of all, going and getting the help that she needed. So her mother's waiting for her to show up, and unfortunately, she never does. And for Marta, this is a problem. She knows her daughter. She knows that Katarzyna is not the type of woman to just not show up for an appointment. So Marta is obviously worried, so she begins by calling some of the friends that she knows Katarzyna talks to. Unfortunately, they weren't helpful because they didn't know anything. They didn't know where she went. They didn't know what she was doing. So eventually she did head to the police station, and they kind of brushed it off. They're like, well, she's 23, you need to wait longer. Most of the time this happens, and then they show up in a few hours or the next day. You shouldn't be too worried. But Marta didn't want to hear it. She knew that something had happened to her daughter, and she was significantly worried. And Marta was so worried and so concerned that she actually hired a private investigator to search for her daughter. And eventually police become involved, but they really aren't finding anything. And due to the fact that Katarzyna had mental health issues, I think a lot of people assume that she either disappeared because she wanted to, or that she committed suicide. So I'm not sure that the search for her initially was taken very serious. But all of that would change almost 2 months later in early January. Crew members aboard the boat named Elk realized that something had been jamming up their propellers. This apparently wasn't an uncommon occurrence, and the crew was usually able to remove whatever had gotten stuck within a matter of minutes. So the crew did as they always do. They opened the latch and began trying to remove whatever was stuck in the propeller. But this time, when they opened that latch, they were hit with a smell so foul and so unusual, they knew that something wasn't right. And that smell just overwhelmed them. And then as they're trying to kind of breathe through it, they're looking out the propeller and they notice that something is wrapped around it, but they can't tell what it is. So they actually began to tug at whatever was wrapped around the propeller, and soon they would discover a human ear. They were able to remove whatever this was wrapped around the propeller, and when they got it onto the ship deck and got a closer examination of it, they realized that it was human skin. Not a body, but actual human skin. And it quickly became apparent that it was a bodysuit made made of human flesh. The crew immediately contacted police, and the police collected it, and through a DNA test, they realized that skin belonged to Katarzyna. And then 8 days later, as they're dragging the river looking for more body parts, her right leg is actually found. Again, the details of this case are graphic, so viewer discretion is advised. So as you can see from the bodysuit, the skin had been taken from her torso and her chest, but her legs, arms, and head had all been removed. And police quickly realized that it was done this way because the killer planned on wearing the skin. And unfortunately, Katarzyna's full body has never been recovered. And police in Poland soon realized that they were kind of over their heads with this case. They had never had a case like this. They weren't really sure where to go and how to navigate it. So eventually forensic experts from the FBI were brought in, and forensic psychiatrists from all over Europe were actually brought in to work on this case. Many years later, Marta, Katarzyna's mother, would go on to recount the moment she learned about her daughter's death. She would say, "This paralyzed me. When I found out what he did to my daughter, I thought I would go crazy with the pain." What was found of Katarzyna's body is obviously investigated, and pathologists determined that she was actually beaten and tortured during the time she was held captive. They found 4 separate puncture wounds on her body. 2 of them were under each armpit, and the other 2 were actually on the inner side of each thigh. And pathologists believe these wounds were actually made to let Katarzyna bleed out. They would also come to the disturbing conclusion that Katarzyna was alive as she was being skinned. Not only would this process be incredibly time-consuming, but it would take a serious, delicate hand to do so. And it seems like the person who did this kept Katarzyna alive because they enjoyed torturing her. I'm obviously not an expert, but if he had killed her first, it more than likely would have been significantly easier to remove her skin. And I firmly believe that he kept her alive so he could enjoy and inflict as much pain and torture on her as he could. Like all investigations, police start in the victim's personal life. They want to find out what the victim was doing months prior, even years prior to their disappearance and murder. They obviously were looking for anything possible that could lead them to her killer. Eventually, police would discover something really interesting. Katarzyna had been skipping classes 3 weeks prior to her disappearance, but her mother, Marta, had no idea that this was happening. And she told police that Katarzyna did the same thing every day. She got up, she got dressed, she had breakfast, and then she went off to classes. And then she came home at the same time every single night. So she really had no reason to suspect that her daughter wasn't going to school every day. And this really gave police their first lead. They realized that she was doing something other than classes, and they needed to figure out what she was doing. So they would contact the only 2 friends that they really could find of Katarzyna's. Their names were Anna and Ula. But to officers' surprise, the friends really didn't know much about Katarzyna. What they did know is that when she would attend class, she did sit in the back of the lecture hall, and she wouldn't engage too much with her peers and classmates, and then when the class was over, she would kind of scuttle out and go to her next one. Investigators would soon realize that Katarzyna was very private and really quite secretive, and she very much kept to herself. What the people in Katarzyna's life did notice is before her death, she actually did start to change her appearance. She began a diet to lose weight and dyed her hair from black to blonde. And this kind of gave investigators an idea. Had Katarzyna met someone, this led them to their next thought. Had the killer intentionally picked out Katarzyna as his perfect next victim? And did the killer encourage her to change her appearance because he knew what he was going to do to her? Unfortunately, because she lived such a private life, police were unable to determine if she had a boyfriend. What they did eventually find out is that during the time she was supposed to be in class, she was often seen walking around the market square. Sometimes she'd go to movies or bookstores. Other times she would do her favorite activity, which was browsing for new music. And police began to theorize that during one of these outings, unfortunately, Katarzyna met her killer. Because this case was so disturbing, a number of criminologists worked on it, and they were all able to agree on a profile for this killer. The profile stated that the killer was male, probably between his 20s and 30s. They also determined that his body type was probably consistent with Katarzyna's, because he probably was watching her and stalking her, because remember, the killer wanted to wear his victim's skin. They also stated that he was a sadistic psychopath with a narcissistic personality, but more than likely he had an above average IQ. They said his motive was sexual, and that he most likely worked as a butcher, a veterinarian, a surgeon, or a tailor. And they said he may even enjoy fishing or hunting. Criminologists would also go on to say that they definitely felt that he stalked his victim before he chose her for obvious reasons. He would need to make sure that he could fit into his victim's skin, and this leaves me with chills every time I think about it. They said that he would also try to befriend his victim, and he would pretty much do this by stalking her. They basically said that the killer was like a chameleon. He was able to watch what his victim was doing, see what movies she liked, what books or music she liked, and then take on those interests himself. He would pretend to love all of these things, and that way he could gain her trust because they have so much in common. They also believed that he more than likely wanted to be a woman, and although that this crime was incredibly brutal, it wasn't personal. And what they meant by that is he didn't hate his victim. Instead, he hated her for being a woman because he wanted to be one. They felt that he was probably introverted and didn't spend a lot of time around other people. Although his crime was sexual in nature, they didn't believe that he would have raped the victim. They believed he would replace intercourse with torture and murder. And what's even more chilling is they believed he would be a repeat killer. And although they had a wealth of information and a really accurate profile, the crime would go unsolved for more than 17 years. The case was reopened in 2012. Investigators actually used a new technology that was a 3D body scanner, so they could now see the extent of the internal and external injuries on Katarzyna's skin. The scan revealed what they kind of already assumed, that she was tortured before her death, but it revealed that she had multiple injuries that were all quite similar. This led investigators to determine that the killer had probably practiced martial arts for quite some time. They were also able to recover a plant material from her skin, but it was not a plant that was found in the river where her skin and parts of her body had been recovered, which meant that investigators could potentially track down where the murder scene was. And later in 2017, a woman came forward and told the police about a man who was obsessed with Katarzyna's case. And what she told them shocked them. She told them that this man actually visited Katarzyna's grave quite often. She would go on to identify 52-year-old Robert Januszewski, and people that knew Robert really didn't like him all that much. He had served in the armies in his 20s, where he worked in a morgue, and after completing his military service, he worked at the Zoology Institute, where he skinned animals and was eventually fired for experimenting on the rabbits. And looking into his personal and early history, Robert really did have a troubled life from the beginning. It was full of abuse and quite the dysfunction among his family. But Robert's name wasn't new to police. As early as 2000, neighbors had told police to look into Robert as Katarzyna's potential killer. They claimed that he was a stalker that often dressed up in women's clothing, but when police searched his apartment, they didn't find anything notable. But when police left, Robert's mother actually watched as Robert threw himself to the floor and screamed that he didn't murder Katarzyna and he was being set up by the guys at the gym. Apparently, after the murder of Katarzyna, people began to notice that Robert was obsessed with religion. And Marta, Katarzyna's mother, began to notice that a candle was always lit and placed on her daughter's grave, and once it finished and the candle burnt out, a new one would be replaced. And she didn't know who was doing this. This actually led police to install surveillance cameras at Katarzyna's gravesite, and they would record Robert visiting Katarzyna's gravesite every single night, and this went on for years. Sometimes he would bring flowers, and the people working at the cemetery would actually say sometimes he brought her letters, but he would bury them. Of course, police went looking for these letters to see if anything was incriminating, but they couldn't find them. So as investigators are kind of honing in and focusing on Robert, they realized that he really just kind of enjoyed walking around aimlessly. He wasn't employed and he didn't have a lot of money, and they found that he often walked around the market square, and on occasion he went to movies. Investigators would recall the profile of the killer and realize that Robert had some eerie similarities, and police believe that's how Robert actually met Katarzyna. Police were able to establish that Katarzyna and Robert knew each other, but during questioning, Robert denied knowing Katarzyna at all. And another search on Robert's apartment actually came up with the most damning evidence that they had found to date. They found Robert's diary, and in his journal, it actually detailed stalking women and the murder of Katarzyna. The details of the diary have never been made public, and I'm sure they never will be. Police were able to piece together what happened to Katarzyna based off all of these things. They said that Robert had met Katarzyna at the market square and he had flattered her, and they soon started talking, and she realized that he had all the same interests as her. And remember, the profile for the killer mentioned that he would do that. They talked about their favorite music and went to movies together, and they said that Katarzyna was actually pretty lonely after her father's passing, and suddenly she found a companion who liked all the same things she did, and that was really exciting to her. It came out that Robert had a clear preference for blonde women, so the fact that Katarzyna had been losing weight and dyeing her hair wasn't shocking to police. And then on that fateful morning in 1998, Katarzyna had agreed to go with Robert to a cottage on the outskirts of the city. They jumped on a bus and headed north. And the cottage was located on this small plot of land that was apparently meant for gardening. And apparently most people actually have gardens outside of the city that they visit on weekends and keep up with. And oftentimes they do have small cottages on the land so that they can stay there. And so obviously on this day, it's the middle of the week. And because most people go to their gardens on the weekend, it's probably very isolated isolated and incredibly quiet there. So really, nobody would ever see Robert and Katarzyna entering into the cottage because people were working. It was a typical work week. I firmly believe that Katarzyna was going with Robert because she liked him in some sort of way, whether it be platonic or romantic, and he had planned a nice day for them out of the city, or so he told her. Evidence would show that he held her captive and tortured her, but it's not possible to determine how long he did that for. And when police searched that cottage, they found Katarzyna's DNA in the bathroom. And remember, during questioning, Robert had denied knowing Katarzyna at all. So it makes no sense that her DNA would have been found in his bathroom if he didn't know her. They theorized that once Robert had removed her skin and Katarzyna was dead, he tried it on, but it wouldn't fit him because he was kind of a short and stocky man, and Katarzyna was actually quite tall. So he did keep the bodysuit for a while, maybe wearing it, maybe not, they're not sure, but then threw it into the river. And that river was actually close to his house, and it was a river he visited often to go fishing. Again, the profile from the criminologist stated that the killer probably enjoyed hunting or fishing, and they were right. And this crime is horrendous. Katarzyna was such a lonely young woman who was dealing with the death of her father, and this man took full advantage of her and tortured her and dismembered her and took her skin off while she was alive. And obviously he did this in a place where he knew that nobody would hear her as she's screaming and fighting for her life. I firmly believed he had this planned for quite some time. Eventually, Robert was arrested, and I believe he sat in prison for 5 years or so while police looked for more evidence. And the last hearing was on March 29th, but all of this has been carried out in private, so it's not clear what's happening, if he's been charged, if he's been sentenced. I'm not really sure about any of that. But that's it for today, guys. If you like this video or any other video on my channel, be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. And of course, I'll be back next week with another video upload. But until then, feel free to check out the other videos while you wait for me. And if you have a suggestion on a case you'd like me to cover, pop it in the comments and I'll try to get to as many of them as possible. Thanks, guys.